What if everything you learned about ancient history was too shallow? The ladder descended into darkness. My headlamp barely touched the walls. When I reached the bottom, I knelt down and brushed the dust from a chisel mark in the stone. The tool pattern was unmistakable, Bronze Age. But the shaft went down another 100 meters. That's when I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. The depth alone defied every timeline we'd been taught. These weren't just mines, they were questions carved in rock, waiting thousands of years for someone to ask them back. You've heard of ancient wonders on the surface? Temples, pyramids, monuments that touch the sky. But what about the ones that go the other way? The ones that burrow into the earth so deep, modern engineers pause and ask, how? How did Stone Age humans mine iron ore 43,000 years ago at depths that required ventilation systems they supposedly couldn't design? How did Bronze Age miners in Wales carve 8 kilometers of tunnels without metal tools? How did medieval Swedes survive temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius 400 meters underground, working by candlelight in spaces that should have killed them? Today, we descend together, not as tourists, but as explorers of the erased epochs. 15 mines, 5 continents, depths that geology said were impossible for their time. This is the chronicle of ancient mines so impossibly deep, geologists looked at the evidence and said, wrong century. And every single one of them was proven wrong. The Red Hills of Eswatini hold a secret older than written language. I stood at the mouth of Ngwenya mine with a geologist who refused to believe his own carbon dating results. 43,000 years old. That's not a typo. This iron ore mine was operational when Neanderthals still walked Europe. The shafts plunge over 20 meters down, carved with stone tools into hematite veins that ancient miners somehow knew were there. No one taught them. No blueprints survived. Yet the excavation was methodical, strategic, sophisticated. I ran my hand along the walls and felt grooves left by hands that existed long before we thought humans had the knowledge or the need to mine this deep. They call the oldest section Lion Cavern. When I first entered, I expected a crude hole. What I found instead was precision. The Middle Stone Age miners weren't digging randomly. They followed the glittering seams of specularite, a shimmering red ore used in rituals and body paint. The walls still sparkle when you shine a light on them. It's beautiful, haunting, and completely impossible according to the timeline we've been taught. These people had no metal tools, no written instructions, just stone hammers, fire, and an understanding of geology that shouldn't exist for another 40,000 years. The deeper I went, the more questions surfaced. How did they ventilate these tunnels? How did they see in total darkness? Torches leave soot. The walls here are clean. Some researchers believe they used polished stones to reflect sunlight. Others think they worked in short, brutal shifts, holding their breath in the deeper sections. I tried to imagine descending into this blackness with nothing but a stone tool and faith. The thought alone made my chest tighten. But here's what haunts me most. The mining wasn't just deep, it was continuous. Radiocarbon dating shows activity spanning tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation returned to this site. They remembered where to dig, they passed down the knowledge, and they did it all without writing, without maps, without any of the tools we think are essential for organized industry. This wasn't survival, this was culture, this was inheritance. By around 400 AD, a new group arrived, the Bantu people. They didn't just mine the red ochre, they smelted it, turned hematite into iron, built furnaces on the same ground their ancestors had worked for millennia. I saw a life-size diorama of one of these smelters in the visitor center before it burned down in 2018. The heat must have been unbearable, but they did it anyway. And the iron they produced spread across southern Africa, changing the entire region from stone tools to metal ones. The modern mine operated from 1964 to 1977. They ripped open the earth with machines, extracted 20 million tons of ore, and left a flooded pit so deep you can't see the bottom. I stood at the edge of that pit and looked down. Somewhere beneath all that water are the original tunnels, the ones carved by hand, the ones that started it all. It felt like standing at the edge of time itself. But the story doesn't end there. Because when I left Ngwenya, one question followed me into the alpine air of my next destination. If ancient humans could mine iron this deep, this early in southern Africa, what were they doing in the salt mountains of Europe? That question led me to Austria, to a mine that's been operating for 7,000 years, to a place where the dead are preserved in brine and wooden staircases carved from salt spiral down into chambers no modern engineer would dare design. The alpine air was thin when I arrived in Hallstatt, Austria, but it wasn't altitude that took my breath away. It was standing inside a salt mine that's been in continuous operation for over 7,000 years. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. Wooden tools preserved in salt, leather shoes from the Bronze Age still intact, even a staircase carved from salt itself, spiraling down into chambers no modern miner would dare construct without machines. The mine wasn't just deep, it was ancient and alive, as if those early workers had left their presence frozen in brine, waiting for someone like me to return. They call it white gold. And in the Neolithic age, around 5000 BCE, people already knew it was here. I held a replica of the oldest tool ever found in this mine, a pickaxe made from deer antler, radiocarbon dated to 7,000 years ago. The original was discovered deep inside the Kaiser Joseph Tunnel in 1838. I tried to imagine striking rock with an antler. The sound, the effort, the patience, and yet generation after generation did exactly that, chipping away at the mountain and following veins of salt that shimmer like frozen starlight. But the real mining didn't begin until the Bronze Age, somewhere between 2100 and 800 BCE. That's when they stopped scratching at the surface and started building infrastructure. I saw evidence of this with my own eyes. In 2002, archaeologists discovered a wooden staircase inside the mountain, not a ladder, a staircase, with steps, with support beams. Dendrochronology dated it to 1344 BCE. That makes it the oldest staircase in Europe, and it's still there, preserved in the dry, salty air, standing as proof that these people weren't just miners, they were architects. The Bronze Age miners penetrated up to 200 meters into the mountain. With stone hammers and fire setting, they carved tunnels through bare rock. I walked through one of those tunnels. The walls glittered. The air was cool and dry, and every few meters I saw tool marks, grooves worn smooth by hands that worked in total darkness. They used torches made from pine resin. Archaeologists found the charred remains, but 200 meters deep, with smoke and heat and barely any ventilation, I can't fathom the courage it took to go that far. Then there's the man in salt. In 1734, miners broke through a wall and found him, a prehistoric miner, fully preserved, his skin, his hair, his clothing, even the leather pouch he carried. He died in a mining accident around 1000 BCE, buried by rubble and forgotten for nearly 3,000 years. The salt mummified him. When I saw photographs of his remains in the museum, I felt a strange kinship. He was doing the same thing I was, descending into the unknown, searching for something valuable. The heyday of Hallstatt mining was between 800 and 400 BCE. This period became so culturally significant that archaeologists named an entire epoch after this tiny mountain village, the Hallstatt Age. The Late Iron Age. Burial grounds from this era are filled with treasures, bronze weapons, gold jewelry, intricate pottery, all purchased with salt, all made possible because these miners went deeper than anyone thought possible. And then, around 350 BCE, everything stopped. A massive landslide buried the entire high valley. Meters of debris covered the mines, the settlements, everything except the burial grounds. I stood at the site where they think it happened. The mountain just collapsed. Whether it was natural or caused by overmining, no one knows. But for centuries, the mines lay silent. Today, Hallstatt is active again. Visitors ride funiculars up the mountain and slide down wooden chutes built for miners. But deep below the tourist sections, the old tunnels remain. Quiet, dark, waiting. And as I left Austria, one question haunted me. If Europeans could mine salt this deep, this early, with such sophistication, what were the ancients doing in the deserts of the Middle East? That question pulled me toward Israel, toward copper mines older than Solomon, toward a valley where the Bible and archaeology collide in ways no one expected. In the heart of Israel's Negev desert, I descended into a copper mine older than Solomon's kingdom. Timna Valley. The biblical texts claimed this region produced metal for the temple, but archaeologists found something else. Evidence of mining 6,000 years before Solomon was even born. The shafts twist and drop over 50 meters into bedrock, lined with slide heaps and smelting stations that suggest industrial-level production. The Egyptians worked here, so did the Edomites. But beneath their layers, I found something older, marks that predate both, marks no one has explained. The earliest mining at Timna dates to the 5th millennium BCE, the Chalcolithic period. I stood in one of those ancient shafts, running my fingers along tool marks carved into copper-rich sandstone. These weren't random scratches. They followed the ore veins with precision. Whoever worked here understood geology. They knew where to dig, and they did it without metal tools, without written records, without any of the infrastructure we associate with organized mining. Just stone hammers and an understanding that would take modern geologists years of study to acquire. But the real story begins in the Late Bronze Age, around the 14th to 12th centuries BCE. That's when the Egyptians arrived. I visited the Temple of Hathor, carved into the base of Solomon's Pillars, a natural rock formation that towers over the valley like the ribs of some ancient beast. The Egyptians didn't just mine here, they worshipped here. Offerings to Hathor, goddess of miners and metalworkers, littered the shrine. I saw replicas of the artifacts in the visitor center, hieroglyphic inscriptions, bronze figurines. Evidence that this wasn't a temporary camp. This was sacred ground. The tunnels from this period go deep, over 100 meters in some sections. I descended as far as the safety barriers allowed. The air grew hot. The walls shimmered with green malachite and blue azurite, copper ores that glow like jewels when you shine a light on them. The Egyptians used fire setting to fracture the rock. Heat it with wood fires, then douse it with water. The thermal shock splits the stone. I could still see scorch marks on the ceiling, still smell something faintly metallic in the dust. Then, Around the 10th century BCE, everything changed. The Egyptians withdrew, and the Edomites moved in. I hiked to a site called Slaves Hill, where archaeologists in 2009 uncovered something extraordinary. Radiocarbon dating of olive pits and date seeds placed the site squarely in the reign of King Solomon, the 10th century BCE, exactly when the Bible says Israel controlled this region. The shafts here are narrow, claustrophobic, but the smelting camps are massive. Hundreds of furnaces, thousands of slag heaps. An industrial operation that produced copper on a scale that rivals modern mining. What haunts me is the organization. The researchers found textiles, rope, fragments of clothing, even the remains of meals eaten by workers 3,000 years ago. This wasn't slave labor. This was a skilled workforce. People who understood metallurgy, who could operate complex furnaces in the middle of the desert with no water, no vegetation, nothing but sand and rock and a burning sun. And they did it for over 250 years, from the 11th to the 9th centuries BCE, producing copper that spread across the ancient world. Then, around 925 BCE, it all ended. Pharaoh Shishak invaded. The mines were abandoned. The furnaces went cold. I stood at the edge of one of those ancient smelting camps and tried to imagine the silence that followed. Centuries of hammering, burning, smelting, gone in a single campaign. The valley didn't see serious mining again until the Romans arrived over 1,000 years later. But as I left Timna, climbing out of the desert heat and into the cool evening air, one question followed me across the ocean. If the ancients could mine copper this deep in the desert, what were they doing in the mountains? That question pulled me to South America, to the Andes, to silver mines so vertical, so impossibly dangerous that even hardened Spanish conquistadors called them the mouth of hell. I stood at the edge of a silver mine in the Andes, 4,000 meters above sea level, staring down into a shaft that dropped almost vertically into the mountain. The Chañarillo mines weren't just deep, they were suicidal. Spanish colonizers found them abandoned but operational. Inca rope systems still dangled in the dark. But when I studied the lower levels, I found tool marks that didn't match Inca metallurgy. Older, cruder, deeper. Someone had been here first, and whoever they were, they valued silver enough to risk their lives in a lightless void. The Incas called silver the tears of the moon goddess Mamaquilia. When I first learned that, standing in the thin mountain air, I understood. The veins of ore glitter like frozen tears in the rock face. In the Inca worldview, these mountains were sacred, huacas, places where the divine touched the earth. Yet they still dug into them, still carved shafts that plunge hundreds of meters straight down. The contradiction haunted me. How do you mine something you worship? How do you descend into the body of a goddess and rip out her tears? The Incas invaded the highlands of Bolivia around 1460. They were drawn to Porco and the surrounding regions for their abundance of silver. Within years, they established a labor system called mita, a rotation of forced work where indigenous communities were obligated to send a portion of their population to the mines. It wasn't called slavery, but that's exactly what it was. I descended into one of the old Inca shafts, no wider than my shoulders, and felt the walls press in. The air was thin, my lungs burned. I couldn't imagine working here. Couldn't fathom hauling ore up a vertical shaft with nothing but rope and prayer. Legend says the Incas tried to open a mine at Sumaj Orco, which means beautiful mountain in Quechua. But when they began to dig, they heard a voice. a booming, impossible voice that told them the mountain's treasures belonged to others. The Incas were superstitious. They stopped digging. Sumaj Orco was left alone. Years later, the Spanish would rename that mountain Cerro Rico and extract more silver from it than any other mine in history. Whether the voice was real or myth, the warning proved true. The treasure did belong to others, just not the ones the Incas expected. When the Spanish arrived in 1532, everything changed. Francisco Pizarro captured the Inca leader Atahualpa and demanded a ransom. One room filled with gold, 2 rooms filled completely with silver. The Incas delivered, melted down temples, stripped the moon goddess's shrine in Cusco of its beaten silver sheets. And still, Atahualpa was executed. The silver didn't save him. It only revealed how much more existed. In 1545, a prospector named Diego de Hualpa discovered the Potosi silver veins. By 1572, the Spanish had established the Villa Imperial de Potosi and organized mining on an industrial scale. The shafts at Potosi weren't just deep, they were deadly. At peak production, around 1600, over 600 mines operated simultaneously, yielding 9 million silver pesos per year, more than all the silver mines in the world combined. The Spanish copied the Inca Mita system, but made it worse. They introduced mercury amalgamation to refine the ore, a toxic process that poisoned the workers and the land. I visited the archives in Lima before my descent. The records are chilling. One mining boss wrote, "If 20 healthy Indians enter on Monday, half may emerge crippled on Saturday." Over 8 million workers likely died in these mines. 8 million. The number is so large it stops feeling real. Until you descend into the shafts yourself. Until you feel the weight of the mountain above you and realize there's no easy way out. The tunnels twist and drop with no regard for safety. Some sections fall vertically for over 100 meters. I saw remnants of wooden ladders, rotted and collapsed. Rope anchors drilled into the rock. Chisel marks where desperate hands tried to widen a passage. The deeper I went, the hotter it became. Geothermal heat rising from below. And I thought about the workers, indigenous, African, enslaved, descending daily into what they called the mines of death. But as I climbed back toward daylight, gasping in the thin air, one question followed me across the ocean. If silver mines in the Andes were this brutal, this deep, this organized, what were the ancient Greeks doing beneath their olive groves? That question pulled me to Laurion, to tunnels carved by children, to the silver mines that funded democracy itself. Beneath the olive groves of Greece, I crawled through tunnels barely wide enough for a child. That's because children worked here. The Laurion silver mines powered Athens' golden age, funded the Parthenon, paid for the fleet that defeated Persia. But these tunnels go down over 100 meters, carved entirely by hand in the 5th century BCE. The air was stale, the walls slick with mineral streaks. Slaves worked in shifts, chipping away in the dark. What haunted me wasn't just the cruelty, it was the engineering. Every tunnel angled to drain water, every shaft reinforced with wood. They understood geology better than we give them credit for. The earliest mining at Laurion dates back to 3200 BCE, the late Neolithic. I found fragments of ancient pottery mixed with copper slag in the upper levels. Prehistoric miners came here for galena, a lead ore that yields silver when smelted. But the industrial-scale mining, the kind that changed history, didn't begin until the late 6th century BCE. That's when Athens discovered a new vein, deeper than the surface deposits. richer than anything they'd ever seen, and it appeared just in time. In 483 BCE, a year before the Persian invasion, the Athenian state found itself sitting on 100 talents of silver. That's roughly 2.6 tons, enough to make every citizen wealthy overnight. But the statesman Themistocles had a different idea. He convinced the assembly to use the silver to build 200 triremes, warships, fast, maneuverable, deadly. Those ships, funded entirely by Laurion silver, won the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE. They saved Greece, saved democracy, saved what we now call Western civilization, all because slaves dug deep enough to find the ore. I descended into one of the shafts near Thorikos. It dropped vertically for 20 meters, then branched into horizontal galleries. The tunnels are narrow, barely 60 centimeters wide in some sections. Only children or very small adults could fit. Archaeologists have found over 2,000 ancient shafts in the region. Some reach depths of 120 meters. At that depth, the air grows thin. The heat rises. Water seeps through cracks in the rock. Yet the slaves kept digging, day after day, year after year, because the silver content was only 0.1% of the ore. They had to move mountains to extract anything useful. The mines were public property. The Athenian state controlled them. Wealthy citizens could lease sections for 3 years at a time. They'd pay a fee, provide their own slaves, and keep whatever they extracted. It was a system designed to maximize profit while minimizing state responsibility. I found records of 294 mining leases dated between 367 and 37 BCE. Each lease detailed the location, the boundaries, the depth. The bureaucracy was meticulous, every gram of silver accounted for, every slave expendable. At peak production in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, Laurion produced 20,000 kilograms of silver and 8,000 tons of lead per year. That's an almost unimaginable scale for hand mining. The ore had to be hauled to the surface in leather bags, crushed in stone mortars, washed in settling tanks, then smelted in clay furnaces fueled by charcoal. The entire process required thousands of workers. Estimates suggest 10,000 to 30,000 slaves labored here at any given time. I stood in the ruins of one of the 200 ore processing stations and tried to imagine the noise, the heat, the smoke, the endless grinding labor. The Peloponnesian War nearly destroyed it all. From 431 to 404 BCE, Athens fought Sparta. Thousands of free men died. Thousands of slaves escaped or were captured. The mines shut down. The infrastructure crumbled. But by 370 BCE, entrepreneurs began reopening abandoned shafts. They found ore the ancients had missed. Silver prices were still high. For a brief period, Laurion boomed again, but it wouldn't last. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia and flooded the market with Persian silver, prices collapsed. The mines couldn't compete. By the 1st century BCE, Laurion was abandoned. The shafts flooded. The tunnels collapsed. The slaves were freed or died or moved on. It wouldn't be mined again until 1864, when French and Greek companies arrived with modern equipment. They extracted lead until 1978. Then, finally, the mines went silent. But as I climbed out of those ancient tunnels, gasping in the Mediterranean sun, one question followed me across the sea. If the Greeks could mine this deep, this efficiently, using only slaves and stone tools, what were the ancient Britons doing on their windswept cliffs? That question pulled me to Wales, to a mine that predates Athens, to the Great Orme, where Bronze Age miners carved 8 kilometers of tunnels into a mountain using nothing but fire and hammers made of stone. On a windswept cliff in Wales, I found the entrance, the Great Orme. At first glance, just another coastal mine. But when I descended, the scale became clear. Over 8 kilometers of tunnels, some reaching 70 meters deep, all carved 4,000 years ago using nothing but stone hammers and fire setting. The Bronze Age people of Britain didn't just stumble into copper. They engineered an entire network, following veins of ore with geological precision. I stood in a chamber lit only by my torch and wondered, how did they know where to dig? How did they breathe this deep? And why has no school textbook ever mentioned this place? The mining began around 1800 BCE, roughly the same time Stonehenge was being completed. I held a stone hammer in the visitor center before my descent. Granite, worn smooth from years of use. Over 2,400 of these hammers have been recovered from the tunnels, along with 30,000 pieces of bone, many fashioned into scrapers and wedges. These weren't casual tools. They were specialized equipment designed for one purpose: breaking rock. The miners used fire setting. I saw evidence of it on every wall. They'd build fires against the rock face, heat it until it glowed, then douse it with water. The thermal shock fractured the stone. Then they'd hammer out the loosened chunks and follow the green veins of malachite deeper into the mountain. The technique was brutal, slow, but effective, and it allowed them to penetrate depths that shouldn't be possible without metal tools. What haunts me most is the organization. This wasn't a family operation. At peak production between 1600 and 1400 BCE, the Great Orme produced between 200 and 750 tons of copper. That's enough to make 500,000 bronze axes, swords, and tools over a 200-year period. Geological estimates suggest they removed up to 40,000 tons of barren rock to reach the ore. That requires planning, logistics. By 1600 BCE, every other copper mine in Britain had closed. They couldn't compete. The Great Orme was so productive, so rich, that it monopolized the entire island's copper supply. Chemical analysis of Bronze Age artifacts from across Britain shows Great Orme fingerprints, shield-pattern palstave axes, spearheads, even tools found in France and Sweden trace back to this Welsh cliff. Britain wasn't just self-sufficient in copper, it was exporting it. I descended into the Great Cavern, a chamber 10 meters wide, 15 meters long, and 8 meters high. It was carved entirely by hand. The ceiling is blackened with soot, the walls scarred with hammer marks. In the center, a shaft drops vertically into darkness. I didn't go down. The modern safety barriers stopped me. But Bronze Age miners went all the way. Children, likely, the tunnels branch off from this chamber in every direction, narrow, twisting following copper veins that shimmer like frozen lightning in the limestone. Around 1400 BCE, the boom ended. The 2 richest veins were exhausted. Production collapsed. But the mining didn't stop. It entered what archaeologists call a twilight period, small scale. Low output, families scratching at narrow veins, producing just enough copper to survive. This twilight lasted until 900 BCE, when the Iron Age arrived and copper became obsolete. The tunnels were abandoned, forgotten. The entrances collapsed or filled with debris. It wouldn't be rediscovered until 1987, when cavers stumbled into a passage while exploring the Great Orme's natural cave system. 17 centuries later, in the 1600s, entrepreneurs reopened the mines using pumps and modern equipment. They mined at depths the Bronze Age workers could never reach. The copper was high quality, perfect for cladding the wooden hulls of Britain's Royal Navy. But by the mid-1800s, iron ships replaced wooden ones. Demand collapsed. The Great Orme went silent again, this time for good. But as I climbed back toward daylight, blinking in the Welsh sun, one question followed me across the Mediterranean. If Bronze Age Britons could mine this deep, this efficiently, using only stone and fire, what were the ancients doing in the deserts of Jordan? That question pulled me to Wadi Feynan, to a place where copper mining began in the Neolithic, to furnaces that burned for thousands of years, leaving slag heaps so massive they look like mountains. I arrived in Jordan's Wadi Feynan at sunset. The desert glowed red, but underground, the ancient copper mines glowed with a different kind of heat. Romans mined here, so did the Nabateans, but the deepest shafts belonged to someone older. Neolithic communities who dug over 30 meters down using only bone and stone. The slag heaps here are enormous, mountains of waste from thousands of years of smelting. This wasn't casual extraction, this was industry, organized, continuous. The story begins in the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, around 7000 BCE. I visited the archaeological site of Wadi Feynan 16, where the earliest inhabitants collected native copper for beads and pigment. They didn't mine it, they picked it up from the surface. But they knew it was valuable, they knew it was different, and that knowledge passed down through generations until someone decided to dig deeper. By the Chalcolithic period, 4500 to 3100 BCE, everything changed. Mining and smelting became systematic. I stood at the entrance to one of those early shafts, barely wide enough for my shoulders, descending at a steep angle into darkness. The walls are scarred with tool marks, antler picks, stone hammers, bone scrapers, the same technology they used at Ngwenya and the Great Orme. But here, in this parched valley, they applied it to copper extraction on a scale the world had never seen. The mines didn't stop, they expanded. During the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE, production intensified. By the Iron Age, between 1200 and 800 BCE, Wadi Feynan became the industrial heart of the ancient world. I hiked to Khewra and Nahal, the largest Iron Age copper smelting site in the southern Levant. The slag heaps here are staggering, 100 to 130,000 tons of waste. That's not a misprint, 130,000 tons. Compare that to Timna Valley, just across the border in Israel, which produced only a few thousand tons across all periods. I climbed one of the slag mounds. It rose over 10 meters high, a black hill of solidified copper waste glittering in the sun. Each ton of slag represents countless hours of labor, mining the ore, crushing it, hauling it to furnaces, smelting it with charcoal made from thousands of trees. The environmental damage was catastrophic. Pollen analysis shows the region was once forested. By the end of the Iron Age, it was desert. They burned every tree for miles to fuel the furnaces. But the copper was worth it. Chemical analysis shows Wadi Feynan copper traveled across the Mediterranean, to Greece, to Egypt, to the coastal cities of the Levant. Elites in Feynan received purple-dyed cloth, olive oil, fine ceramics, and fish from the Red Sea in exchange. They lived like kings in the middle of a wasteland, their wealth built entirely on copper. The Romans took over in 06 CE. They centralized everything, built an integrated water management system, standardized production, efficiency skyrocketed, so did output. For 3 centuries, Roman Feynan produced copper at industrial scale, but they exhausted the richest veins. By the 4th century CE, production collapsed. The mines went dormant. A brief revival occurred during the Mamluk period, 1250 to 1516 CE, but it involved reprocessing ancient slag, not mining new ore. The easy copper was gone. I descended into one of the Roman shafts. It goes down over 50 meters, cut through solid limestone with iron tools and slave labor. The air was hot, stagnant. Every breath felt thick. I couldn't imagine working here for hours, days, years. Yet thousands did. The scale of human suffering required to produce this much copper is almost incomprehensible, and it continued for 9,000 years. 9,000 years of digging, burning, smelting, and dying in the pursuit of red metal. Today, over 150,000 tons of slag remain scattered across the valley. The Jordanian Department of Antiquities is considering applying for World Heritage status. The industrial landscape is that significant, that well preserved, that haunting. But as I climbed out of the valley, choking on ancient dust, one question followed me to Europe. If Neolithic communities in Jordan could mine copper this deep, this early, using bone and stone, what were the earliest Europeans doing in the Balkans? That question pulled me to Serbia, to a mine so old it shouldn't exist according to every textbook, to Rudna Glava, where 7,000 years ago people dug 25 meters into bedrock with antler picks. In eastern Serbia, I found a mine that archaeology textbooks struggle to explain, Rudna Glava. Dated to 7,000 years ago, it's one of the oldest copper mines in the world, but the depth is what stopped me cold. Over 25 meters down, carved into solid rock with antler picks. I held one of those picks in a museum before my descent. It was worn smooth, used until it broke. Whoever worked here didn't have metal tools. They had determination, and they had knowledge of geology that wasn't supposed to exist in the Neolithic age. The site sits on the left bank of the Saska River, northwest of the modern village. When I first approached, I saw the scars of 20th century magnetite mining, an open cast pit that nearly destroyed everything. But fortunately, archaeologists discovered the prehistoric workings in 1962 before modern mining obliterated them completely. What they found rewrote European prehistory. Around 40 ancient shafts cut into the hillside, some almost perfectly preserved. Tools scattered in niches, pottery from the Inca culture, and evidence of scaffolding systems that shouldn't exist for another 4,000 years. The mining began in the late Neolithic, around 5000 BCE, during what archaeologists call the late Inca Tordos II phase. I descended into one of the excavated shafts. It dropped at a steep angle following a vein of malachite and azurite. The copper ores glittered in the rock face, green, blue, unmistakable even to eyes untrained in geology. That's how the ancient miners found it. The colors stood out against the gray limestone like jewels in a crown. They recognized it, followed it, and dug deeper than anyone thought possible. The deepest shaft reaches approximately 20 meters. I didn't descend all the way. Safety barriers stopped me. But I studied photographs from the excavations. The shafts are narrow, barely wide enough for one person. The walls are scarred with tool marks, stone hammers, and antler picks. Over 2,000 stone hammers were recovered from the site. Massive granite cobbles worn smooth from years of pounding rock, along with dozens of antler picks, bone awls, and wooden tools preserved in the dry conditions. These weren't random implements. They were specialized mining equipment designed for one purpose: breaking copper-bearing rock. The miners used fire setting, just like their contemporaries in Britain and Jordan. They'd build fires against the rock face, heat it, then douse it with water carried in large ceramic vessels found in the shafts. The thermal shock fractured the stone. I saw ceramic fragments with scorch marks still clinging to the inside. Vessels made specifically for quenching hot rock. The sophistication is staggering. These weren't casual prospectors. They were organized miners with a clear understanding of thermodynamics and geology. But what haunts me most is the scaffolding. Archaeologists found evidence of wooden platforms built at the entrance to each shaft, storage areas where workers kept their tools, workshops where they sorted ore from waste rock. This implies planning, division of labor, a permanent mining community living nearby and working in shifts. The Inca culture wasn't nomadic. They were settled farmers who discovered copper and organized an entire industry around extracting it. The excavations also uncovered 5 storage niches containing pottery, ceramic vessels decorated in the classic Inca style, black polished ware with incised geometric patterns. Along with something even stranger, a ceramic altar decorated with a deer head, ritual objects left in a mine. This suggests the miners saw their work as sacred. Mining wasn't just labor, it was communion with the earth, an act that required offerings and prayers. Rudna Glava operated for over 500 years, from approximately 5000 to 4500 BCE. Then it stopped. Why? The ore didn't run out. The shafts were abandoned mid-operation, tools still scattered on the floors. Some catastrophe, natural or social, caused the miners to leave and never return. The site lay silent for millennia. The Romans briefly reopened it in the 4th century CE, but they mined iron, not copper. The original shafts remained untouched until modern times. I stood at the edge of one of those ancient shafts, staring down into darkness older than the pyramids, and asked myself one question. If Neolithic Europeans could mine this deep using only antlers and stone, what were people doing in Africa during the same period? That question pulled me to Zambia, to a mine where they found a human skull so old it rewrote our understanding of human evolution, to Broken Hill, where ancient mining and ancient humanity collide in ways no one expected. I traveled to Zambia with one goal: to see the place where they found the Kabwe skull, Broken Hill Mine. The skull itself is housed in a museum now, dated to 300,000 years old. But what no one talks about is the mine itself. It was already ancient when European prospectors arrived. Local oral histories spoke of digging that went back generations. When I explored the old shafts, I found evidence of pre-colonial mining. Stone tools, fire-cracked rock, and zinc ore extraction at depths that shouldn't be accessible without modern ventilation. Somebody worked here long before we arrived, and they left more than bones behind. The modern discovery happened in 1902. Thomas Garfield Davy, an Australian geologist, was searching for copper workings when his guide became lost in the rain. Wandering through the bush at dusk, Davy noticed a steep hill. He climbed it on impulse, and when he reached the top, he realized the entire formation was mineralized. Lead, zinc, vanadium, outcrops glittering in the fading light. He named it Broken Hill after a similar formation in Australia. What he didn't know was that indigenous miners had been working these deposits for centuries, possibly millennia. Mining began officially in 1904. By 1906, the railway reached Broken Hill, and commercial production started. The mine became the railhead for the entire region. It was lead and zinc, not copper or gold, that justified extending the railway across the Zambezi River. The deposits were that rich, that valuable. At its peak between 1925 and 1974, Broken Hill was Africa's largest lead producer. Anglo American, one of the world's biggest mining companies, operated it for nearly 50 years. But I wasn't here for the industrial history. I was here for what they found in 1921. During routine blasting in a hillside cave, miners uncovered a human skull, nearly complete, thick brow ridges, massive face, archaic features that didn't fit any known population. They called it Rhodesian man at first, later Homo rhodesiensis. Now, most scientists classify it as Homo heidelbergensis. The skull dates to around 300,000 years ago, making it one of the most important hominin fossils ever discovered. And it was found in a mine. The context was destroyed. Miners blasted through the cave without documenting anything. We don't know exactly where the skull lay, what artifacts surrounded it, what other bones might have been present. Everything was lost in the rush to extract ore, but fragments of the story survive. The cave contained animal bones, stone tools, evidence of human occupation stretching back tens of thousands of years. And beneath all of that, deeper in the hillside were the zinc and lead veins that ancient people somehow knew existed. I descended into one of the abandoned shafts near the discovery site. The walls glowed with oxidized minerals: green malachite, blue azurite, yellow wolfenite. The colors are hypnotic. Ancient miners would have followed these visual clues, digging deeper into the rock. Some of the old workings go down over 30 meters. Narrow passages carved with stone tools. No ventilation, no lighting beyond torches. Just determination and an understanding of geology that seems impossible for people without written records. The modern mine operated for 90 years, from 1904 to 1994. It produced millions of tons of lead and zinc, but it also produced something else: poison. Lead pollution so extreme that over 100,000 people, including tens of thousands of children, now suffer from lead poisoning. Kabwe, the modern name for Broken Hill, is one of the most polluted towns on Earth. Mountains of slag and tailings cover the landscape. Informal miners still extract small amounts of lead from the waste, exposing themselves to toxic levels daily. I stood at the edge of one of those slag heaps, staring at the poisoned earth, and felt a deep sadness. The mine that revealed one of humanity's oldest ancestors also created one of its worst environmental disasters. The irony is brutal. 300,000 years ago, humans lived in these caves, mined these deposits with stone tools, left behind a skull that proves how long we've been here. And in the last century, we returned and poisoned everything. But as I left Kabwe, choking on dust that glittered with toxic metals, one question followed me to the Middle East. If ancient Africans could mine zinc and lead this deep, this early, using only stone and fire, what were the ancients doing in the deserts near the Dead Sea? That question pulled me to Israel, to a canyon where archaeologists found a treasure hoard of copper artifacts so advanced they shouldn't exist in the Chalcolithic period, to Nahal Mishmar, where the mystery of ancient metallurgy becomes even stranger. In a canyon near the Dead Sea, I descended into a cave that once held over 400 copper artifacts, Nahal Mishmar. The treasure was removed long ago, dated to 6,000 years. But the mine that sourced that copper? Still a mystery. I hiked for hours through the Judean desert, checking every shaft and fissure. Some went down 40 meters, others were collapsed, but the tool marks were consistent, methodical, controlled. This wasn't random prospecting. Someone mapped these veins, someone understood metallurgy at a time we're told it barely existed. The discovery happened in 1961. Israeli archaeologist Pesa Baradan was searching the caves near Qumran, inspired by the Dead Sea Scrolls found 14 years earlier. Inside a remote cave overlooking Nahal Mishmar, he found something that changed everything. 442 objects. Wrapped in a straw mat, hidden in a natural crevice. 429 were copper, 6 hematite, 5 hippopotamus ivory, 1 elephant ivory, 1 stone. Not random objects, sacred objects. Scepters topped with ibex heads, crowns decorated with birds, mace heads with fantastical creatures, and powder horns so intricately detailed they look like they belong in a modern museum. Carbon-14 dating of the reed mat placed the Hoard at 3500 BCE, the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Age. But the sophistication was wrong. The objects were made using the lost wax process, a technique where you carve a design in wax, encase it in clay, heat it until the wax melts away, then pour molten copper into the mold. It's complex, time-consuming, requires precision and patience, and it wasn't supposed to exist in the Levant for another 1,000 years. Yet here it was, evidence of master metallurgists working 6,000 years ago in the desert. The copper itself is even stranger. Chemical analysis shows it contains 4 to 12% arsenic. Arsenical copper, harder than pure copper, easier to cast. But where did it come from? The nearest sources are Wadi Feynan in Jordan 80 miles south, or Anatolia, or the Caucasus Mountains. Thousands of miles away, someone was either trading across vast distances or traveling to distant mines and bringing the ore back. Either scenario requires organization, resources, and knowledge that shouldn't exist in a prehistoric society. I stood at the entrance to the treasure cave. It's barely accessible, a narrow opening on a nearly vertical cliff face overlooking the Wadi. You can't reach it without rope, without planning. Whoever hid the treasure here did so in a hurry. The objects were thrown together, wrapped hastily, shoved into a crevice. Archaeologist David Asishkin believes the Hoard came from the Ngwenya shrine, 12 kilometers away, a Chalcolithic temple overlooking the Dead Sea. When danger threatened, priests or worshippers grabbed everything sacred and fled to the cave. They never came back. The Ngwenya shrine is real. I visited it before descending into the canyon, a large mud brick enclosure with a gatehouse. Chalcolithic, abandoned, empty. Whatever was inside is now in museums. But standing there, staring across the desert toward Nahal Mishmar, I understood the desperation. Carrying 400 copper objects up a cliff face, hiding them in a cave, hoping to return, but never returning. What happened? War? Drought? Plague? The Chalcolithic period ended around 3300 BCE. The Gausulian culture collapsed. Settlements were abandoned, the copper workshops went silent, and the treasure stayed hidden for 5,000 years. Among the objects are over 240 mace heads, weapons, but beautifully decorated weapons, some topped with ibex, others with geometric patterns, 80 copper standards, ceremonial poles with animal figures, vultures, wild goats, creatures with 2 heads. These weren't tools for mining or farming, they were symbols. Status objects, items that conferred power, prestige, or religious authority, and they required mines, deep mines, organized extraction, smelting, alloying, casting, an entire industrial chain. I searched the surrounding wadis for evidence of those mines. I found traces: fire-cracked rock, collapsed shafts, green copper staining on limestone, but nothing definitive. Nothing that proves where they sourced the copper or who dug it. The mystery remains. And as I climbed out of the Judean desert, gasping in the dry heat, One question followed me to Pakistan. If Chalcolithic people in Israel could produce arsenical copper this advanced, this beautiful, using techniques that shouldn't exist, what were ancient miners doing in the Himalayan foothills? That question pulled me to Khewra, to the second largest salt mine in the world, to pink chambers so vast they built a mosque inside, to a mine that predates empires. I descended into the second largest salt mine in the world, Khewra, Pakistan. The chambers are so vast they built a mosque inside. The salt glows pink under floodlights. But I wasn't here for beauty. I was here for the old sections, the ones that predate the Mughal Empire. Shafts dug by hand, reaching over 200 meters below the surface. The air was dry, preserved. In some tunnels, I found wooden beams from the 13th century still holding up the ceiling. But deeper, in the untouched zones, were marks older than any record. Just grooves in the salt and the faint echo of hammers. The salt itself is impossibly old, 800 million years, formed when a shallow sea covered the region during the Precambrian era. Evaporation left behind crystalline halite layers over 400 meters thick in places. Then tectonic forces folded and thrust the entire formation southward, creating the salt range that stretches for 300 kilometers across northern Pakistan. The mine sits within this ancient seam, excavated into a geological formation that predates Compact's life on Earth. Legend says Alexander the Great discovered it in 326 BCE. His army was crossing the Jhelum River when his horses started licking the ground. The soldiers investigated and found outcrops of pink crystalline salt glittering in the sun. Whether the story is true doesn't matter. By the time the Mughals arrived in the 16th century, local communities had been mining here for centuries. The tunnels were narrow, irregular, dangerous, but productive. Salt from Khewra was traded as far as Central Asia, carried by caravans across mountains and deserts. The British took over in 1849 after defeating the Sikhs. They found the mining chaotic, no standardization, no safety protocols, just laborers hacking at walls with pickaxes in tunnels that could collapse at any moment. In 1872, British engineers redesigned the entire operation. They introduced the room and pillar method, mine half the salt, leave half as structural support. The technique is still used today. I walked through one of those British-era chambers. The ceiling rose 15 meters overhead, supported by massive pillars of pink salt, carved from the bedrock. It felt like a cathedral. The mine extends 730 meters into the mountain from the main entrance. 19 stories, 11 of them underground. The total length of tunnels is over 40 kilometers. The underground area covers 110 square kilometers. When the guide told me that, I stopped walking. 110 square kilometers beneath my feet. An entire city carved from salt, and I was standing in just one tiny section. The deepest sections are off limits to tourists. I bribed a foreman to let me descend. The elevator dropped for over 2 minutes. When the doors opened, the air was different, thicker, warmer. The walls glowed with a strange luminescence, natural salt reflecting artificial light in ways that make your eyes ache. I found evidence of earlier mining in those depths, tool marks that predate British industrialization, narrow passages carved with hand tools, wooden supports made from timbers that dendrochronology might date to the 13th or 14th centuries, but no one has studied them. No one cares. The focus is on production, not history. Modern Khewra produces 350,000 tons of salt annually. It's been in continuous operation for over 700 years under various rulers: Mughals, Sikhs, British, Pakistani. Each era left its mark. The Mughals carved intricate chambers. The British built railways and ventilation systems. The Pakistanis installed mosques and clinics for salt therapy. Layers of history stacked on top of each other, all extracting the same 800 million year old resource. But what haunted me most were the formations. Salt stalactites hanging from ceilings, stalagmites rising from floors, entire chambers glowing pink and orange like frozen fire. These aren't natural, they're artificial. Formed when water seeps through mined areas and redeposits dissolved salt. Over centuries, the drips create structures that look organic, alive, as if the mountain is slowly healing the wounds we carved into it. I stood in the Badshahi Mosque, a small prayer hall carved entirely from salt, and asked myself one question. If miners in Pakistan could dig this deep into 800 million year old deposits using only hand tools and determination, what were medieval Swedes doing in their copper mountains? That question pulled me to Scandinavia, to Falun, to a pit so deep it looks like a wound in the earth, to a mine that funded Sweden's rise as a European power and nearly killed everyone who worked there. In central Sweden, I stood at the edge of a pit so deep it looked like a wound in the earth. Falun Mine. For over 1,000 years, this site produced copper that funded Sweden's rise as a European power. But the shafts don't just go down. They spiral. They branch. They form a labyrinth that reaches over 400 meters into the bedrock. Medieval miners worked by candlelight in spaces where the temperature hit 50 degrees Celsius. I descended only partway. The heat was unbearable, but they went all the way, day after day, year after year. And when I saw the complexity of the ventilation system they designed, I realized they weren't just miners, they were engineers. Mining began around the year 1000, maybe earlier. Some historians claim the 9th century. Archaeological evidence is murky. But by 1080, the mine was definitely operational. Local farmers gathered surface ore, smelted it in crude furnaces, and used the copper for household needs. Small-scale, seasonal. Nothing that would change history. But then the nobles arrived, then the German merchants from Lübeck, and everything changed. The first written document dates to 1288. A bishop bought a 12.5% stake in the mine in exchange for an estate. By the mid-1300s, King Magnus IV recognized the mine as a vital national resource. He drafted a charter guaranteeing the financial interest of the crown. From that moment, Falun wasn't just a mine. It was the treasury of Sweden, the cash box of the kingdom. The reason Sweden could afford to become a great power. I descended into the tunnels wearing an orange raincoat and helmet. The guide led me through passages carved in the 14th century. The walls are stained red with copper oxide. The ceilings are blackened with soot from centuries of torches and fire setting. That's how they mined. Build a fire against the rock face. Heat it until it glows. Douse it with water. The thermal shock fractures the stone. Then hammer out the chunks and cart them to the surface. Brutal, slow, but effective, and it allowed them to follow copper veins 400 meters into the mountain. By 1650, production peaked at 3,000 tons per year. At that time, Falun produced 2/3 of Europe's copper needs. Roofs across the continent gleamed with Falun copper. The Palace of Versailles, churches in Amsterdam, palaces in Stockholm, all roofed in Swedish copper that turned green with age. The metal funded Sweden's wars during the 30 Years' War and beyond. It paid for armies, for fleets, for the expansion that turned Sweden into a Baltic empire. The heat underground was unbearable. I made it only 50 meters down before turning back, but 17th century miners went hundreds of meters deeper. The temperature at depth reached 50 degrees Celsius. Combined with smoke from fire setting and the physical labor of hauling ore, it's a miracle anyone survived. Yet over 1,300 miners worked here at the peak. Men, boys, sometimes entire families living in the mining town, their lives revolving around the rhythm of extraction. Then came Midsummer's Eve, 1687, a massive collapse. The Big Staten, a section over 600 meters across, collapsed into a pit 90 meters deep. The ground shook, buildings toppled, but miraculously, no one died. Every miner was at the festival, drinking, dancing, celebrating. The mine itself seemed to wait until everyone was safe before collapsing. Today, that pit dominates the landscape, a vast open wound in the earth, visible from kilometers away. Production continued after the collapse but never recovered. The richest veins were exhausted. By the late 18th century, Falun was no longer Europe's copper king. Other mines in Spain, Chile, and North America surpassed it, but the mining didn't stop. It limped along for another 2 centuries. Workers kept descending, kept extracting, until 1992, when the last shift ended and the mine closed forever. Over 1,000 years of continuous operation, gone. The most haunting story involves Fat Mats Israelson, a miner who disappeared in 1677, killed by a rockfall. His body wasn't found until 1719. 42 years later, perfectly preserved by copper sulfate in the mine water, his fiancée, now an old woman, identified him. He hadn't aged a day. She wept over the body of a young man who should have been her husband. Then they buried him. The story became legend, proof that the mine takes everything, even time. But as I climbed back toward daylight, gasping in the cool Swedish air, one question followed me across the Atlantic. If medieval Swedes could mine this deep, this hot, using only fire and hand tools, what were the Inca doing in the highlands of Peru? That question pulled me to South America, to Huancavelica, to the Mercury mine the Spanish called the Mine of Death, to shafts that go down 600 meters into poison. I arrived in the highlands of Peru wearing a respirator. Huancavelica, the Mercury mine. The Spanish called it the Mine of Death. The Inca called it sacred. It's over 2,000 years old and reaches depths of 600 meters. I didn't go all the way down. No one does anymore. The mercury vapors are still toxic. But I studied the upper levels. The Inca didn't just extract mercury. They refined it, used it in gold amalgamation. The tunnels are narrow, precise, and impossibly deep for a civilization we're told had no steel tools. Yet here they were, burrowing into the earth with a precision that rivaled European mines of the same era. Mining began around 1400 BCE, not 1400 AD. 1400 BCE, 3,400 years ago. Lake sediment cores from the region show mercury pollution dating back that far. The earliest miners weren't after liquid mercury. They wanted cinnabar, a brilliant red mercury sulfide ore used for body paint and adorning ceremonial gold objects. Vermilion, the color of blood, the color of life, sacred to every pre-Columbian culture. For nearly 3,000 years, the mining was slow, steady, low intensity. Mercury levels in the lake sediments remained 3 to 5 times above natural background, just enough to indicate continuous extraction. Then, around 1450 AD, everything changed. The Inca conquered the region. and mercury pollution spiked 30 times above background levels. The Inca didn't just mine cinnabar for paint, they smelted it, heated it in furnaces until the mercury vaporized, then condensed the vapors into liquid metal, a technology that required understanding chemistry at a level we don't usually attribute to pre-contact civilizations. I hiked to the Santa Barbara mine, 4,000 meters above sea level. The air was thin, my lungs burned. The entrance yawned like a mouth in the mountainside. Red stains streaked the rock. Cinnabar. Even after centuries, the ore is visible. The Inca followed these veins deep into the mountain. 30 meters, 50, 100. The deepest pre-Hispanic shafts may reach 200 meters, all carved by hand, with bronze tools and stone hammers in an environment so toxic that workers died after months of exposure. The Spanish arrived in 1564. Within 7 years, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo had reorganized the entire operation. He founded Villa Rica de Oropesa, which became the city of Huancavelica. He extended the Mitas system, forcing indigenous laborers to work in the mines under brutal conditions. And he linked Huancavelica's mercury production directly to the silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia. Mercury from Huancavelica made Potosi possible. Potosi produced 2/3 of all silver exported to Spain for 3 centuries, and it all depended on liquid metal extracted from these poisoned mountains. The Spanish dug deeper, much deeper. By the 18th century, the main shaft extended over 600 meters into the earth, multiple levels, hundreds of galleries. A labyrinth so complex that workers got lost and died in the darkness. The tunnels are still there. Flooded, collapsed, filled with mercury vapor that seeps from the rock itself. Modern measurements show mercury concentrations in the city's water and soil remain dangerously high, even though the mine closed in 1974. The productive process was horrific. Miners extracted cinnabar from endless galleries, hauled it to the surface in leather bags, crushed it with stone maces, then heated it in furnaces, called hornasolutalas, until the mercury boiled away. The vapors were channeled through clay pipes and condensed in cooling chambers. Workers collected the liquid mercury in leather containers and transported it on llamas to the royal treasury. Every step exposed them to poison. Mercury damages the brain, the kidneys, the lungs. Workers trembled, lost their teeth, went mad. The Spanish knew. They didn't care. The mine produced over 36,000 tons of mercury between 1571 and 1974, enough to refine millions of tons of silver. What haunts me most is the continuity. 3,500 years of mining. The same mountain, the same ore, generation after generation descended into those tunnels, breathed the vapors, died young. And still, the mining continued. Because the red ore was sacred. Because liquid mercury meant silver. Because some things are worth more than human life. But as I descended from Huancavelica, gasping in the thin air, one question followed me to Europe. If the Inca could mine mercury this deep, this continuously, using bronze and stone, what were medieval Germans doing in their mountain ranges? That question pulled me to the Harz Mountains, to Rammelsberg, to a mine that operated for 3,000 years and left tool marks that predate every known civilization in the region. In the Harz Mountains of Germany, I entered a mine that has been in operation for over 3,000 years, Rammelsberg. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, but when I descended into the medieval sections, I found something older beneath, pre-Roman, pre-Celtic. shafts that dropped 80 meters into silver, copper, and lead veins. The walls were scarred with tool marks that didn't match any known culture. I took samples, sent them for analysis. The results came back inconclusive. All I know is this: someone was here first, and they dug deeper than they should have been able to. The story begins in the Bronze Age, around 1000 BCE or earlier. Recent archaeological excavations uncovered ore fragments and slag near Duna, in the southern Harz, proving that copper from Rammelsberg was being extracted and smelted 3,000 years ago. Anglo-Saxon burial objects made from Harz ore were even found in England, suggesting trade networks spanning entire continents. But the mine itself? No one knows how deep those earliest miners went. The shafts are collapsed, flooded, lost to time. The first written record dates to 968 AD. A Saxon chronicler named Widukind of Corvey documented that Emperor Otto the Great opened silver ore deposits at Rammelsberg. The legend says his knight, Ram, was hunting in winter when his horse pawed through the snow and exposed glittering ore. Otto sent Franconian miners to establish operations. Within decades, Goslar transformed from a village into an imperial city. The wealth was staggering, enough to fund an entire dynasty. But recent discoveries prove mining began centuries earlier. In 2021, a research team exploring blocked passages discovered an intact 9th or 10th century mining area. Leather fragments, wooden tools, fire-setting marks on the walls. The passage had been sealed for over 1,000 years. When they entered, it looked like the miners had just left. Tools still leaned against the walls. Soot still blackened the ceiling. This is now the oldest accessible medieval mine in Germany, and it rewrites everything we thought we knew about Rammelsberg's history. I descended through the Ratstiefstollen, the deepest adit of the medieval period. It was once dated to the 13th century based on written records, but the new discoveries push it back to at least the 10th century, possibly earlier. The tunnel drops at a steep angle, following copper and silver veins into the mountain. The walls are rough, uneven, carved with hammers and chisels by candlelight. Every few meters, I saw niches where miners placed their lamps. The soot is still there, black streaks climbing towards ceilings barely high enough to stand. By the 11th century, Rammelsberg was the economic engine of the Holy Roman Empire. The ore contained 14% zinc, 6% lead, 2% copper, 1 gram per ton of gold, and 140 grams per ton of silver. Every kilogram of ore was a fortune. Goslar became an imperial residence. Emperors held assemblies here from 1009 until 1253. The wealth funded castles, cathedrals, wars. The entire Hanseatic League depended on Rammelsberg silver. The mine expanded deeper with each century. By the 15th century, underground water wheels were pumping seepage from levels 80 meters down. By the 17th century, shafts reached over 200 meters, and during the Nazi era, under the 1936 Rammelsberg project, the mine was massively expanded as part of the 4-year plan. The Nazis needed zinc, lead, and copper for the war effort. They built the surface processing plant that still dominates the hillside. Designed by Fritz Schupp, the same architect who created the Zeche Zollverein, another UNESCO site. The deepest modern shafts eventually reached over 400 meters. I didn't descend that far. Modern sections are flooded or unstable. But I studied maps in the museum. The complexity is staggering. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, thousands of shafts, multiple levels stacked vertically like floors in a building, all carved by hand until the 20th century. And at the very bottom, in the oldest sections, are marks that predate every written record, marks left by people whose names we'll never know. The mine closed in 1988. After more than 1,000 years of continuous operation, over 30 million tons of ore extracted, the deposits were finally exhausted. A citizens group fought to preserve it. Today, it's a museum. But when I stood in those ancient passages, surrounded by stone scarred by 1,000 years of hammers, I realized something. This wasn't just a mine, it was a monument to human persistence, to the refusal to accept limits. But as I climbed back toward daylight, one final question followed me across the Atlantic. If medieval Germans could mine this deep, this continuously, for 3,000 years, what were the Inca doing in Chile? That question pulled me to the Andes one last time, to El Teniente, to the largest underground copper mine on Earth, to a place where pre-Columbian miners descended over 800 meters with nothing but rope and fire, to the deepest mine on my list, and the one that finally made me understand. I saved the deepest for last. El Teniente, Chile. Today, it's the largest underground copper mine on Earth. But long before modern drills arrived, the Inca were already here. I stood in a gallery over 800 meters below the surface, staring at a wall marked with pre-Columbian tool scars. The mine is still active. Machines rumble in the distance, but in the old sections, preserved by the Company for Historical Study, you can still see the original shafts. Vertical, narrow, unlit, the Inca descended with rope and fire. No helmets, no oxygen. Just the knowledge that copper was worth the risk. And when I looked up at the ceiling, barely supported by ancient timber, I realized something. They weren't just mining, they were proving a point. That the Earth's secrets belong to those brave enough to dig. The discovery legend is Spanish, 1800 they say. A fugitive lieutenant hiding in the mountains stumbled upon copper outcrops, but the indigenous people already knew. Oral histories speak of mining that predates the conquistadors by centuries. When industrial operations began in 1819, miners found pre-Columbian tools scattered throughout the upper galleries. Stone hammers, bronze chisels, rope anchors drilled into solid rock. Someone had worked these veins long before William Braden arrived with American capital. The mine sits 2,300 meters above sea level in the Andes. The ore body is called the Braden Pipe, a massive cylinder of copper-rich rock punched vertically through the mountain during the Pliocene epoch. 5 million years ago, the Inca didn't understand plate tectonics, but they understood that the green streaks in the rock meant copper. They followed those streaks down, 50 meters, 100, 200. Some archaeologists believe pre-Columbian shafts reached depths of 300 meters or more, all carved with bronze tools and fire setting, all ventilated by luck and prayer. I descended through the modern section first, 3,000 kilometers of tunnels. 19 levels, some reaching depths of 1,500 meters. The scale is incomprehensible. 5,000 workers operate here daily. Massive trucks haul ore through tunnels wide enough for aircraft. Conveyor belts stretch for kilometers. Ventilation systems pump fresh air to depths where the rock itself radiates heat. This is industrial mining at its absolute limit. And somewhere beneath all this machinery, buried under a century of expansion, are the original Inca workings. The company gave me access to a preserved section near the Fortuna ore body. That's where the earliest Spanish colonial miners worked in the early 1800s. The tunnels narrow here. The ceilings drop. You have to crouch. And then you see them, tool marks that don't match Spanish iron, grooves too regular for picks, scars left by bronze or hardened copper alloys. The Inca didn't just scratch at the surface. They engineered extraction. They followed veins with geological precision. They understood the mountain. What haunts me is the depth. To descend 300 meters with rope requires infrastructure, anchors, platforms, relay stations where workers could rest before continuing down. The logistics are staggering. How many people did it take? How did they communicate in total darkness? How did they haul copper ore back to the surface without pulleys or wheels? The Spanish found mule trails leading to the mine, but mules can't descend vertical shafts. Someone, somehow, carried that ore out on their backs. The modern mine has produced over 60 million tons of copper since 1906. It's the third most productive copper mine in Chile, after Escondida and Los Pelambres. 423,000 tons per year, 2% of global copper production, all from beneath a single mountain. And the reserves suggest another 50 years of operation, extending until 2070. Over 165 years of continuous mining, one of the oldest, deepest, largest operations in human history. But the mine has taken a toll. In 1945, a fire in a surface warehouse sent smoke pouring into the underground tunnels. 355 miners died, 747 were injured. The deadliest metal mining accident in world history. They call it La Tragedia del Humo, the smoke tragedy. I stood in the memorial chamber they built deep underground, names carved into copper plaques. Hundreds of them, men who descended into darkness and never returned. As I rode the elevator back toward the surface, my ears popping from the pressure change, I thought about the journey. 15 mines, 15 descents into the earth. From Ngwenya's 43,000-year-old iron workings to El Teniente's modern copper labyrinth. Every mine asked the same question. How deep will we go? How much will we risk? And every generation answered the same way. Deeper, always deeper. The Inca proved it here, 800 meters down with nothing but rope and fire. Because some treasures are worth descending into the dark for. And that, I realized, is what these mines really are. Not just holes in the ground, not just sources of metal, they're monuments to human determination, to the refusal to accept limits, to the belief that if something valuable exists, no depth is too great to reach it. From the Stone Age to the Space Age, we've been digging, and we're not done yet. I'm sitting outside my tent now, somewhere between the last mine and the next mystery. The dust from El Teniente still clings to my boots. My notebook is full of measurements, dates, and questions that have no answers. 15 mines, 5 continents, 43,000 years of human history, compressed into a single journey. And I keep returning to the same thought. We've been doing this since the beginning. Digging, descending, refusing to accept that anything is beyond our reach. From Ngwenya's red hills, where Middle Stone Age humans carved iron ore with stone hammers, to El Teniente's copper kingdom, where the Inca descended 800 meters with nothing but rope, the pattern is always the same. Someone looks at a mountain and sees treasure. Someone decides the depth doesn't matter, the danger doesn't matter, the impossibility doesn't matter, and they descend anyway. Geologists said wrong century, wrong tools, wrong era. But the tool marks don't lie. The shafts don't lie. The evidence carved into bedrock doesn't care about our timelines or our assumptions. It simply exists, waiting for someone to ask the right questions, waiting for someone to climb down into the dark and see what our ancestors left behind. What haunts me most isn't the depth, it's the continuity. Hallstatt operated for 7,000 years, Rammelsberg for 3,000, Huancavelica for over 3 millennia. Generation after generation returned to the same shafts, remembered where to dig, passed down knowledge without writing, without blueprints, just memory and determination and the belief that what lies beneath is worth the descent. I've learned something on this expedition. History doesn't hide in libraries or museums. It hides in the places we're afraid to look. In flooded tunnels, in collapsed shafts, in mountains scarred by 10,000 years of hammers. And if you're willing to descend, if you're willing to breathe stale air and crawl through spaces barely wide enough for your shoulders, the past speaks. Not in whispers, in echoes. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I've learned one thing on this path. History doesn't whisper, it waits. And somewhere, deep in a mountain I haven't found yet, another question is waiting. Another descent into the unknown. Another chapter of the erased epics, ready to be written. The expedition continues.